I don't have a book. I'm going to hold it up. They did a great job, but we'll get to that. I'm really, really grateful for the Basilica of Saint Mary and Father Hathaway and Alex and Hillary for your kind hospitality and invitation to present to you my new book, which I'm holding imaginarily in my hand as I do. It's entitled 365 Days of Catholic Wisdom, a Treasury of Truth, Beauty, and Goodness. And Tan Books published it with a marvelous preface by my good friend Joseph Pierce. It's probably the best written part of the book. And those of you who know Joseph Pierce know what I'm saying. And it's a big book. I think it's almost 700 pages. But it's only meant to be read like a page or a page and a half, 2 pages a day. So, don't let that scare you. I would like to dedicate this evening to the late John Morehouse. John was a friend. John was the editor of this book and my last book, How to Keep from Losing Your Mind, both from Tan. And he passed away suddenly last week in the middle of the night. He was only 51 years old. He left behind his wife, Robin, with whom I had a wonderful lunch here in Alexandria only 6 months ago, and 5 young children. There is a GoFundMe page. It's called the John Morehouse Family Relief Fund. And he was quite a guy, and it was his friendship and guidance that were integral to both of the books. And you'll also be integral to the one I'm going to be writing with Matt Schlapp after the first of the year on the so-called canceling the culture movement. And Matt and I will really be hunting for bear on that one. When John agreed to publish this book, he said, if you really want to get it out before Christmas, you could do it. You need to do it 4 months, max 5 months. Now, if I was holding up the book right now, that would be a much more impressive statement because it's such a big, beautiful book. And I, in characteristic form, said, no problem. So I sat for hours on my couch. Here it comes. In the man cave, the Hudson man cave, gaining 10 pounds for the next 150 days. But we got it done. And I think Tan made it very beautiful. And John and I had a big fight over the color of the book. I mean, really, it was the only thing we ever fought about. The green that they put on it I thought was going to be too dark. But I even got a ribbon. A ribbon. When you get a ribbon in a book, you have arrived. So there it is. In retrospect, now that the book is out, been out for about a month, 6 weeks, this book appears to be a tribute to reading itself, the place reading and books have in our lives. Since I became a Catholic at the age of 34, I've often said I read myself into the church. I even did articles where I listed the books. But I know I should say I prayed myself into the church. That would be more spiritual to say. But the books that I read were my prayer. Over a 10-year period, I was led to become Catholic. Many kinds of experiences change lives. Many kind of events cause us to adopt greater purposes in our lives, to look at ourselves more honestly, to hope for greater things. And they can even cause conversions. But reading, I would argue, has a pride of place among those experiences. Why? Certainly, it begins with the conveyance of ideas that books provide. Not only of ideas, but of history, biography, and God's own revelation in a book we call the Holy Bible. Christians are rightly called people of the book. You know, back when I was a Baptist minister in Atlanta, a great old church called Druid Hills actually looked kind of like a Catholic or high Episcopal church on Ponce de Leon right there. Whenever the preacher held his Bible, it would literally bend. One side, both flaps would bend over his hand like a U, like a horseshoe. I always thought they must have some machine that they put these Bibles on to make them that loose. But it also was a symbol to me of what it means to be a people of the book. You know, there's another reason why I think reading is the most impactful of the kind of events that change our lives. To put it bluntly, the mind must work. When you read, you have to work, and it's your mind that works. And even further, for the mind to work well, there must be some kind of silence. There must be some kind of special attention, no multitasking. You can't read and watch a TV movie. You can't read and listen to obnoxious music. And you especially can't listen to good music. Because today I had on Haydn, a piano version of Haydn's Seven Last Words of Christ from the cross. Just as I started, I'd been playing it, and I realized within seconds I had to turn that music off. I couldn't write. It was competing with this gorgeous Haydn piece. So you can have the kind of noise that remains outside the mind's field of vision. It's called background noise. Has to be real background, far back. And the greatest passages we read will slow us down, even stop us. They will evoke rereading. And if you're reading Kant, you're going to have to read it 20 times to understand it. Or Hegel. Any of those German idealists. You got to read them over and over again. Either that or they're just nuts. So you evoke rereading and reflection. Now, the very first passage I chose is an example of something I read in 1980, before I became Catholic, by Jacques Maritain, and it just stopped me. And I have remembered it over and over again since I read it now 40 years ago. Let me read it to you. He wrote this in 1961 based upon a lecture he gave at Princeton where he was in residence. He said, and I want you to listen really closely to this. A time will come when people will give up in practice those values about which they no longer have any intellectual conviction. These remarks apply to democracy in particular, in a particularly cogent way, for the foundations of society of free men are essentially moral. There are a certain number of moral tenets about the dignity of the human person, human rights, human equality, freedom, law, mutual respect, and tolerance, the unity of mankind, and the ideal of peace among men, on which a democracy presupposes common consent. Without a general, firm, and reasoned-out conviction concerning such tenets, democracy cannot survive. Now, when I first read it, I put a little bombshell by it, in pencil always. Little did I know the bombshell would go off in American history. Then there are the passages that literally changed me. Think about it. Reading. Look, St. Augustine. Read it. And he opened the Bible and read a passage that changed his life. There are lots of stories. Somebody should write a book about that. There are passages that literally changed me and placed me in a new relation to God and conferred freedom on my constricted soul. I read this passage in manuscript form, given to me by its translator before it was published by Ignatius Press in 1979, from Hans Urs von Balthasar's The Heart of the World. When I read this, I knew I was going to become Catholic. For Christ's weakness would already be the victory of his love for the Father, reconciliation in the eyes of the Father, and as a deed of his supreme strength. This weakness would be so great that it would far surpass and sustain in itself the world's pitiful feebleness. He alone would henceforth be the measure and thus also the meaning of all impotence. He wanted to sink so low that in the future all falling would be falling into him. And every streamlet of bitterness and despair would henceforth run down into his innermost abyss. All falling, mine, yours, everyone's, would be falling into him. It wasn't until I read that passage that I really understood what grace meant. And I had been to seminary. All falling would be a falling into him. Now, 365 days, Catholic wisdom, includes philosophy, theology, history, memoir, novels, short stories, letters, interviews, spirituality, stories of saints, and, of course, poetry. The poet Dana Gioia, a great Catholic poet, one of our country's great poets, helped guide me to some of the Catholic poets who thus far lack the attention they deserve. One of these is Elizabeth Jennings, English woman who lived from 1926 to 2001. I want to read you her poem entitled Lazarus. How many of you ever heard of Elizabeth Jennings? That would be none for those of you watching on the stream. This poem is called Lazarus. Well, I didn't know much about her until Dana mentioned it myself. Okay. It was amazing white. It was the way he simply refused to answer our questions. It was the cold plate glance of death upon him, the smell of death that truly declared his rising to us. It was no chance happening, as a man may fill his silence. Between two heartbeats, seemed to be dead and then astonish us with the closeness of his presence. This man was dead. I say it again and again. All of our sweating bodies moved toward him, and our minds moved too hungry for finished faith. He would not enter our world at once with words, that we might be tempted to twist or argue with. Cold, like a white root pressed in the bowels of the earth, he looked, but also vulnerable, like birth. Now, naturally, we want to read it again and again. But, reading, poetry is reading par excellence. It requires more from the reader than prose. And its rewards, though, are often greater. The best poems call us back not only because of their beauty, but because of their deeper wisdom. Remember the last 4 lines of the poem I just read by Elizabeth Jennings. He would not enter our world at once with words, that we might be tempted to twist or argue with. Cold, like a white root pressed in the bowels of earth, he looked, but also vulnerable, like birth. Now, if Jennings were here, we would ask her, why would Lazarus not enter our world at once with words? Why did he not speak? We'd ask, because that's what the poem raises, that question. Hopkins, Belloc, Kershaw, Dante, Charles Peguy, Paul Claudel, John Allen Wyeth, the great World War I Catholic poet, Rainer Maria Rilke, Charles Baudelaire, Alice Meynell, Angelus Silesius, Hildegard of von Bingen, and William Shakespeare can also be found in this book. In fact, one thing John Morehouse asked me to do is cut out 4 or 5 poets. He said I had gone overboard with the poets. And I think we got it right. I'm asked how I made that deadline of 5 months. I began, you might tell, with the passages that had marked my journey into the church. And subsequently, the even harder journey of being a Catholic. On the first day of writing, I had assembled a stack of about 100 books on the floor in front of my couch in the man cave. As I opened them to find the passage, I could recall the approximate place and page in the book of the passage that had been so important to me. I mean, this is after 40 years or more. Then, after I finished those, I made a stack of Catholic writers I most admired. And I made sure I'd included the novelists: O'Connor, Percy, Mauriac, Bernanos, Bois, Sigrid Undset, Caroline Gordon, Alice Thomas Ellis, Shasako Indo, Morley Callahan, the great Canadian writer, Julian Green, Heinrich Boll, whose very first short story is excerpted in 365 Days, Alessandro Manzoni, The Betrothed, Alfred Dublin, Maurice Baring, and John Hassler, a wonderful Midwestern Catholic writer whose novels used to be popular, and I hope they will be again. If some of these names are new to you, did anybody here not recognize some names? Raise your hand if you didn't recognize names. Is there anybody here who recognized all of them? That's good. I wanted a book that would surprise you. I wanted a book that would surprise you with authors you didn't know about or only vaguely knew about, that are so compelling that you would search out more about them and read more of what they had written. But don't worry. There's plenty of familiar names in this book. But I didn't want my choices to be predictable. My My first principle of teaching is the students will never know what that class is going to be like before it happens. Never going to be the day like it was the day before or the day before that. Something different is going to happen. That's how learning happens. You don't let the mind or the student get too comfortable. Some of these familiar passages, of course, are well known, but are just too darn good to leave out. For example, a wonderful passage from G.K. Chesterton's book on St. Francis. And by the way, Chesterton, every single sentence is practically quotable. No matter where you read. But in this book on St. Francis of Assisi, he uses the image of a world turned upside down to evoke the saint's vision of radical dependence on God. He writes, St. Francis might see and love every tile on the steep roofs or every bird on the battlements, but he would see them all in a new and divine light of eternal danger and dependence. Instead of being merely proud of his strong city because it could not be moved, he would be thankful to God Almighty that it had not been dropped. He would be thankful to God for not dropping the whole cosmos like a vast crystal to be shattered into falling stars. Perhaps St. Peter saw the world so when he was crucified head downwards. And who writes sentences like that anymore? I'm going to reread that sentence. He says, instead of being merely proud of his strong city because it could not be moved, he would be thankful to God Almighty that it had not been dropped. He would be thankful to God for not dropping the whole cosmos like a vast crystal to be shattered into falling stars. That kind of writing changes lives. That kind of writing deepens our belief. It certainly deepens our understanding of what it means to be a Christian, of why our understanding of existence, of what's out there, and who we are, is different from those who don't share our faith. For us, the whole world could crash in a moment. It's only God's will and God's love that secures our existence at all. I should have put that in the book. But I am in the midst right now, with the help of my son Cyprian, who says hello, of packing all my books. We are moving to Atlanta, God willing, early in the next year. After 26 years here in Virginia, it's time to go back to the town I still think of as home for many reasons. I was married there. My daughter was born there. I got my doctorate there, and I had my first 9 years of teaching there. And they were very happy years. I'm asked why I'm taking all my books. The average weight of our book boxes, I have found, is 30 to 35 pounds. So far, Cyprian and I have packed more than 30 boxes in the pod in the driveway. That's over 1,000 pounds. And we've only just begun packing the books that are in the various bookcases around our house. We will end up with 70, 80 boxes of books. I don't want to calculate that. All I know is they would not all go into a single pod because the pod limit is 4,200 pounds. Now, how can I say this? I mean, why would I put myself through this, carrying all these books and paying for it? How can I say this without sounding corny or sentimental? My books are a part of me. They've shaped my mind, my heart, and my dearest beliefs. And there is so much more I want to read and need to read. Books arrive at my house with predictable regularity. There are mothers, and I'm married to one, who cannot throw away a baby picture no matter how bad it is or crumpled up it is. Or a third grade drawing, no matter how terrible it is. Well, I can't leave my books behind. So there. My library represents what I cared most about through all my 71 years. It is also symbolically a buffer between me and a culture saturated with hate, falsity, and lies. Reading is the sursum corda of the mind. The lifting of the mind out of confusion and incomprehension toward the intelligibility of the world, a world shaped by a word, a logos, through which all things were made. Thank you very much. I will entertain questions.
Yes, if anybody would like to ask a question, just raise your hand and I will bring over the mic.
Old friend privilege.
Speak a little louder, maybe.
I'm taking the old friend privilege of asking the first question.
But let me hear it.
To what
Speak loud.
institution of higher learning will you be donating your library?
What'd you say?
To whom, to what institution will you donate your library? Ed Bullner donated his to Hillsdale.
Well, after Cyprian takes what he wants, I don't know. I gave a bunch of books to Christendom a long time ago, 20, 30 boxes. But when I'm in Atlanta, I'll probably give them to some Catholic institution in Atlanta. There's some young Catholic colleges there. Maybe I'll be part of one going forward, but definitely they'll go into a Catholic institution. But I want to make, sometimes when you donate books, they sell them on eBay. Not happening. So I want to make sure they go somewhere where they're actually put on the shelf. Come on, there got to be more questions. This gentleman has a question here.
How many hours a day do you read? How many hours a day do you read?
Oh, when am I leaving?
No, how many hours a day do you read?
Do I read?
Do you read, yeah. What's your normal schedule?
Well, I would say I read 2 hours a day or 3 hours a day books and another 2 hours or 3 hours audiobooks. I own over 1,000 audiobooks. Many of them are classics. And to give you one example, when I listened to Moby Dick read by very famous audiobook artist Frank Muller, it just absolutely came alive. Absolutely. And War and Peace, Three Musketeers, Les Miserables, Proust. And sometimes, an audiobook will get me started into a major work, and I'll then pick up, once I'm in, I start reading it. But I've been, like right now, I'm reading a famous historical account of the last days of Adolf Hitler by the English officer who was the first one into the bunker after the British forces came into Berlin. And again, the way it's read, it's magnificent. I mean, it's you can read it. You can read it. It's good, but when it's read to you, and there's a certain vivity that makes it come alive even more. Now, there are some books you can't listen to that way. Certainly, a lot of poetry. It's hard. I have to read poetry myself, and I have to read it at my speed. And I tried to listen to Paradise Lost, had to read it. Tried to listen to Dante, even though I'd read Dante more times than I can count. No good. But so I'm working on 2 books a day, one that I'm reading, and one that I'm listening to, and it's amazing if you do that every day. You do that every day, how much you learn, and and you also then you can't turn on junk television or junk streaming services and not feel like this isn't worth it. This is junk. This is mind junk. You can do Maggie first since you're standing there. Okay.
Are there 1 or 2 books that you have found yourself giving to others as gifts most often, and why?
1 or 2 books that I give most often or recommend most often? Yeah. 2. The Intellectual History of Europe by Friedrich Herr, H-E-E-R. Herr was a historian at the University of Vienna all during the time of the rise of the Nazi Party. Very, very eminent man. And he had written books on the Renaissance, the Middle Ages. He had written books on history of the Jews. He had actually, after the war, he received a special honor from the nation of Israel for his work on the Jews. But the Intellectual History of Europe, which he wrote, I believe, in the concentration camp, is the most penetrating account of the emotional and intellectual currents that both created Europe, Christian Europe, and demolished it. It's a book that glows in your hand. I mean, just like, it's that good. The other book is a book called Bloodlands by Timothy Snyder. It's a book about the destruction done by Hitler and Stalin through their whole careers, but with a special emphasis on what Stalin did in the 30s in the Ukraine, or the 20s, and then after the war. He was, I think, he didn't die until, 1957, something like that. But Snyder has created a panorama of slaughter. As I said in my book from last year, How to Keep from Losing Your Mind, somewhere along the line, I learned how evil we can really be. I was watching John Wayne and the Searchers the other night, and he's Ethan Edwards, and he's hunting down his niece who's been living with the Indians, and the nephew that's with him, he considers naive, and he says something like this: he says, he doesn't understand the darkness that lies in the heart of man. And Bloodlands if you can read that and then not better grasp what modern and contemporary human beings are capable of. I mean, we're still not to the 100th anniversary of World War II. We just celebrated the 100th anniversary of World War I, which was insane, absolutely insane. And, you know, you look at what politicians are saying, you know, cultural media stars are saying, and you see it all kind of fulminating again. You know, their self-righteousness, the censorship of opposing views, the attempts at personal destruction of anyone who gets in the way. I mean, let's put them in jail. Let's bankrupt them. Let's make it sure they can never get a job again. In other words, no mercy, no consideration of humankind whatsoever. It's happening again. Now, I'm not saying it's going to turn into anything like a Reich. I'm just saying, be aware that we aren't past that yet. We will never be past that. We will never be past what happened in World War I, World War II, in Rwanda. We will never be past. And there still are Holocausts in parts of Africa. We all have to realize that human nature is still falling that low now, and capable of falling even lower if we don't realize. I think one reason, all of these accounts that I've read, most of the United States didn't believe the concentration camp story because they didn't think anybody would do it. They didn't think anybody could do something that horrible. You know, and they just come out of World War I. They had just seen carnage that had never been seen in the Western world. You know, what, 60,000 died on the first day of the Psalm? You know, and most of them died within the first 2 minutes? What kind of insanity is that? That was all done for the sake of honor. You know, duce et decorum est. And you've got to look past the packaging, even of me, all of you, all of us. We all are capable. When you read the stories of the build-up toward the Third Reich, when you read the stories of how Stalin took control and who he included and who he didn't include, of course, eventually he got rid of everybody that was close to him early on. Two things. A lot of people just didn't believe how inhumane, brutal, and heartless these men could be. Number two, they knew how it was, but they personally profited from it. So they went along with it. I don't know which is worse. So, great question. But intellectual history of Europe and Bloodlands.
Deal, I'm afraid I have to ask a multifaceted question. With the backdrop of Here and Snyder, and the fact that you and Matt are about to write about the cancel culture, what's your projection, one, and two, process? How you're moving back to Atlanta, how are you and Matt going to do this collaboration strictly by Zoom technology? And who will be replacing, there is no replacing John, but who will succeed John in trying to edit you and Matt. Okay, got all those three parts?
They don't know yet.
Okay.
But the publisher, Conor Gallagher, is a very special man, and he's created out of the remains of 10 books a vibrant and exciting publishing program. Of course, when Matt and I have discussed the how we will organize the book and what he'll do and what I do, obviously he gets politics and I get culture. But we want to do it in a way, and Matt Schlapp is very emphatic about it being a Catholic book. Wants it to be a Catholic book. And I do too. Because he believes, as I do, there's something advantageous about the Catholic understanding of the world and morality and human nature, and that is more probing and more beneficial to the subject of politics, the subject of culture and philosophy and so forth. I mean, it's not for no reason that you have this whole, in the last 40 years, one after another of great evangelical brains have become Catholic. And I'm not trying to hurt anybody's feelings up there. There still are great evangelical brains, many of them. But Scott Hahn, to mention one, and in other words, we haven't deeply tapped the reservoir of sound Catholic teaching and also Catholic affection, not just ideas, but the possibility of real community. One thing that is, when I became a Catholic in 1984, one thing I've noticed ever since I became a Catholic is a lack of community. Too much rivalry, too much preening, too much hero worship, too much side taking, good guys, bad guys. There are small communities around the country that certainly very vibrant and powerful and do good work. But we need to move nationally. And we need to say, okay, we're not going to let the 1619 Project be taught in any Catholic context. It's a lie. It's a complete lie, fabrication. And of course, who sponsored it? New York Times. Supposedly the number one newspaper in the United States has become a joke. So there has to be, and as you well know, Maggie, the reason we don't have that is because our own leadership is not committed to it. All the time I was at Crisis, was 12, 15 years, I was constantly butting my heads against bishops. Not all of them, but Cardinal Law, who turned out to be a friend, called me and busted my butt. Cardinal George called me and told me that the trouble with American founding, it was based upon Enlightenment individualism. And it encouraged selfishness. And that's why he, didn't trust the Republican Party. Great churchman, but disagreement on that. And but when you look at our colleges, with the exception of a dozen, when you look at many of our seminaries, when you look at what the Catholic Conference doesn't say, not what it says, but what the things it doesn't say, this community is going to have to be built from the bottom. This community is going to have to be built. under the strata of clergy, religious, so forth. It's going to have to come from underneath. And I think to a great extent in the presidential campaigns, going back to the one I led Catholics for Bush in 2000, I think there is an amazing amount of connecting going on at the grassroots level that is like night and day compared to 1996 or 7 or 8. And I have a weekly Zoom call with Jeff Cavins, a marvelous biblical scholar. His Bible now, the Bible he helped edit, is now the largest selling Bible in the world. And we discuss these things because we've all been through the various wars, he at EWTN and I in the world of politics and the church. And so in one way, we wait on our bishops and priests. In another way, we try to get ahead of them. And I think they understand that. Many of them accept it and applaud it. So this book will be we did record it, didn't we? Okay, so this is where Matt and I are going with this new book.
Dr. Hudson, thank you for coming tonight, and he will have a book signing, and he will sell copies of his book over at our Lyceum Auditorium, which, if you're not familiar with where that's at, if you go out the front door, take a right, go to the corner to Duke Street, take another right, and you'll see it there. And Hillary will be walking over there right now, so you can follow her if you're not sure where it's at. And again, Dr. Hudson will be signing books. Thank you.
Alex, thank you, and to thank all of you for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.